Killing the man at the top is the easy part to narrate. What comes after is where things become more complex. Because the death of a ruler does not automatically tell you what comes next. Sometimes it opens a path to change. Sometimes it hardens the system he built. And sometimes it does something worse than either of those things. It destabilizes the whole region before it changes the state at all. That is the question now hanging over Iran. Not simply whether the regime is wounded, it clearly is, but whether this war leads to regime change, managed succession, hardline consolidation, or something much uglier and wider before any real change arrives. Because the endgame is not just about who rules Tehran next. It is about how much destruction the region absorbs before that question is settled. The first thing to say plainly is that Khamenei's death did not produce immediate political collapse. Reuters reported that many Iranians celebrated while loyalists mourned, exposing a deep fault line inside a country stunned by the death of a man who ruled for 36 years. AP later reported that Mojtaba Khamenei was named successor by the Assembly of Experts, while Reuters reported that hardliners moved quickly to secure continuity after the strike. So, from the state's point of view, this was not a revolutionary vacuum, it was a succession crisis to be managed under fire. And that matters because it tells you straight away that whatever this war becomes, it is not beginning from a clean slate. The machinery of the Islamic Republic was already built to survive leadership shocks. Britannica is clear that the supreme leader sits above virtually all functions of the state, and that the system includes a clerical mechanism for selecting a replacement. So however dramatic Khamenei's death is, it does not mean the institutions vanish with him. That is the first uncomfortable truth of this endgame. A hated ruler can die, and the system can still survive him. There is also the question of mourning, and that matters more than it may sound. Iranian state media announced a 40-day mourning period after Khamenei's death, a move deeply resonant in Shia political culture, and one that immediately gave the state a ritual framework for continuity, symbolism, and mobilization. That does not mean the entire country entered mourning in any sincere or unified sense. Reuters reported that many Iranians were celebrating, while the regime staged rallies of loyalty to Mojtaba Khamenei. But it does mean the state moved quickly to wrap succession inside sacred political theatre. And in systems like this, ritual is not decoration. It is a tool of legitimacy. A managed transition inside the Islamic Republic may preserve the state, but it may satisfy almost no one. Mojtaba Khamenei is now the new supreme leader, and that fact is politically significant in itself. Reuters has long described him as a hardline cleric with deep backroom influence, close ties to the IRGC and Basij, and growing leverage across Iran's security apparatus. His rise tells you a great deal about where power now sits. This is not a turn toward openness. It looks much more like the security state consolidating itself through a familiar family name and a trusted hardline network. It also cuts awkwardly against the ideology the Islamic Republic once claimed to stand for. The Republic was founded in opposition to monarchy and hereditary power. Yet the office of Supreme Leader has now passed from father to son. Reuters noted last year that Mojtaba's possible succession was controversial, precisely because any hint of dynastic politics sits badly in a state born from revolution against a US-backed monarch. Time made the same point this week. A father-to-son succession in the Shiite clerical establishment risks outrage because of how plainly hereditary it looks. So, if the system is trying to project continuity, it may also be advertising its own contradiction. That is one reason this does not simply settle the question of power. Mojtaba may offer continuity for the IRGC and the hardest parts of the state, but he also comes in carrying weaknesses. He has influence, but not the same public authority his father built over decades. He is closely aligned with the guards, which may reassure hardliners but alienate other parts of the establishment. Reuters reports that Ali Larijani has emerged again as a pragmatic power broker, which is one sign that Tehran is not a monolith. So, Mojtaba's rise may project strength and fragility at the same time. In systems like this, hereditary succession can do both. At the same time, the internal political picture is more complicated than a simple handover. Reuters reported on March the 7th that real divisions had opened up between hardliners and more pragmatic factions after President Masoud Pezeshkian apologized to Gulf states and said attacks would stop unless Iran was struck first. That angered senior figures in the Guards and other hardliners, according to Reuters. So, what we are looking at is not just succession at the top, but an argument inside the system over how to survive. One side appears to favour rigidity, escalation and tighter security control. The other appears more concerned with containing fallout and preserving the state through some degree of recalibration. Neither side is offering a democratic rebirth. This is not reform versus freedom. It is hardline survival versus pragmatic survival. That distinction matters. And that same day, in Dubai, people were reported an intercepted drone and debris at Terminal 1 airport, which only underlined how little of that supposed restraint was being felt on the ground. And that is why I would be very careful with the word revolution at this stage. There are many Iranians who want the regime gone. Reuters' January reporting and the protest death toll makes that absolutely clear. OHCHR warned in February that people detained after the nationwide protests faced disappearance, executions, and a severe lack of transparency. Reuters reported hospital raids and the detention of injured protesters, while Iran Wire has reported torture, death sentences, custodial killings, and chronic disruption long after the streets quietened down. So yes, there are political activists, prisoners, families, and ordinary people inside Iran who imagine a different country. But wanting the regime to collapse and having a viable post-regime political structure are not the same thing. One is a moral and emotional reality. The other is a question of institutions, leadership, force, and time. And time, in wars like this, is rarely kind to civilians. More than that, for many Iranians, this is not one war arriving from outside. It is an external war landing on top of an internal one the state has already been waging for years. The beatings, the prison torture, the disappearances, the death sentences, the hospital raids, the phone checks, the suffocation. All of it means people are suffering on two fronts at once. That burden on civilians is already visible. OHCHR said the situation was worsening and widening by the hour, with fear, panic, and anxiety spreading across the region. It explicitly referred to the attacks on Iran, Iran's retaliation across the region, and Hezbollah's subsequent entry into the conflict. This is important because it means the endgame is not only being written in Tehran, it is being written in Gulf airports, in Lebanese displacement, in school rubble, in blackout cities, and in the wider regional fear that there may be no obvious off-ramp. Lebanon is one of the clearest signs of that danger. Reuters reported that Lebanon was pulled deeper into the war after Hezbollah launched missiles at Israel, prompting Israeli operations to intensify. Reuters also reported that Israel appears ready to keep hitting Hezbollah even after the wider US-Israeli war on Iran cools. Once a front opens, it does not necessarily close, just because another one dominates the headlines. And if the IRGC and its network genuinely cared about Lebanese civilians, they would not provoke from Lebanese territory at a moment when Israel was already primed to widen the war. At the same time, Israel plainly has its own agenda and was willing to use Hezbollah's actions as the opening to push deeper into Lebanon. Ordinary Lebanese people are paying the price for both. Reuters reported today that almost 700,000 people have been displaced in Lebanon, including about 200,000 children. The map keeps widening, the politics keep lagging, and civilians keep paying first. There is also a bigger strategic picture here, and it is worth being careful with it. The United States has clearly been trying to squeeze two major sources of discounted oil that help China, Iran, and Venezuela. Reuters reported in January that after Maduro's removal, Washington allowed China to keep buying Venezuelan crude, but not at the deeply undercut prices that had existed before, while Reuters also reported that China had become deeply reliant on cheap Iranian oil. That does not prove the war was launched in order to close Hormuz, but it does support the idea that this conflict sits inside a wider contest over energy leverage, sanctions pressure, and China's access to cheap oil. And this is why Hormuz matters so much in the bigger picture. It is less a regional waterway than a pressure valve for the global economy. The EIA says roughly 20 million barrels a day passed through Hormuz in 2024, while the EIA says around 20 million barrels a day of oil and oil products and just over 112 BCM of LNG transited in 2025 equals to about a quarter of global seaborne oil trade and nearly a fifth of global LNG trade. So the fear is not that Iran somehow becomes the legal sovereign of the Strait. It cannot. The issue is de facto coercive control. Mines, missiles, drones, seizures, insurance panic, and navigational risk can make ships stop moving, even without a formal legal closure. UKMTO advisories made that distinction explicitly, saying there had been no formal legal closure even as the operational environment became severe. Why does that matter so much in money and power terms? Because if Iran can credibly threaten Hormuz, it gains leverage not only over its enemies, but over the export lifeline of Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Iraq, and Bahrain. That means leverage over oil prices, LNG prices, freight rates, insurance costs, refinery planning, inflation, and government budgets far beyond the Middle East. Reuters and CBS are already reporting oil spikes, stranded shipping, and a White House scramble to limit the political fallout from higher crude and gasoline prices. In plain terms, whoever can intimidate Hormuz can impose a kind of unofficial tax on the world economy. They do not need to win a conventional war. They just need to make insurers nervous, ship owners pause, and traders bid up barrels. That is also why outside powers keep returning to this corridor. For the United Kingdom and the United States, the mission is not old-style ownership. It is preventing a hostile actor from turning geography into a standing veto over global trade. Britain's posture is framed around freedom of navigation and maritime security. It has a naval support facility in Bahrain. UKMTO acts as a shipping security hub, and the wider US Fifth Fleet architecture in Bahrain is built around monitoring threats and protecting merchant traffic. The longer the route looks unsafe, the more these outside powers are pulled in. On Russia, the picture is relatively direct but opportunistic. SIPRI says Russia imported Iranian one-way attack drones and other missiles in 2021 to 25. Russia also tends to benefit when energy markets tighten, because higher oil and gas prices can support its own revenues and complicate Western sanctions pressure. China is different. Beijing is not helped by a blocked Hormuz in the way Russia may be, because China is heavily exposed to Gulf energy flows. But China still matters enormously to Iran because it is an economic lifeline. Reuters reports that China bought more than 80% of Iran's shipped oil in 2025. So the issue is not that China wants Hormuz shut, it is that China helps Iran survive sanctions, keep selling oil, and remain embedded in a wider non-Western network. The alignment is real, but it is not perfectly unified. Russia can monetize energy panic more easily. China still wants cheap, reliable flows and stable sea lanes. Europe has lived through a version of this before. Reuters reported in 2022 that benchmark European gas prices quadrupled over the course of a year as Russia's war and the sanctions fallout hit supply, while households faced much higher energy bills and governments scrambled to cushion the blow. The world withstood it, but not cheaply. That is the comparison worth keeping in mind if Hormuz becomes a standing crisis rather than a short, sharp shock. The official language from Washington now tells you a great deal about how the US sees the endgame. CENTCOM says Operation Epic Fury began at the president's direction and is intended to dismantle the Iranian regime's security apparatus, prioritizing targets said to pose an imminent threat. That is broader than simple deterrence language. It sounds like a campaign aimed at the security state itself. Trump's language sharpens that picture. Reuters, citing CBS, reports that he now says the war is very complete and far ahead of schedule, that he has no message for Mojtaba Khamenei, and that he is even talking about taking over the Strait of Hormuz. That is not the language of a narrow, reluctant intervention. It is the language of leverage, victory, and control. The economic side tells a less triumphant story. CBS reports that the White House says oil and gas prices are now a top priority, that it is reviewing all credible options, and that it believes prices will fall once the objectives of Operation Epic Fury are achieved. At the same time, Brent and WTI briefly surged to around $119 a barrel before falling back below $100, still far above where they were before the war began. CBS also reported Brent had been around $79 before the war widened, and that the average US gas price had jumped to $3.48 a gallon, up 48 cents in a week and 58 cents in a month. For an ordinary person, that is not an abstract market move. It means higher petrol costs, pricier transport, renewed inflation pressure, and less room in the monthly budget. So, even as Washington speaks in the language of momentum, the market is reminding everyone that strategy has a price, and crude is often where the bill arrives first. Which is, in fairness, a fairly efficient summary of modern war. The war also now carries a very literal image of what escalation means in a dense city. Reuters images from March 8th show the Sharan fuel tanks in Tehran burning, with smoke and flames rising over surrounding residential areas. That matters because once oil and fuel depots are hit inside a city, the line between strategic target and civilian fear becomes very thin indeed. It is one thing to talk abstractly about degrading fuel networks, it is another to watch a city burn around them. There is a broader historical layer here too. Iran is not simply the Islamic Republic. Britannica notes that Iran was the heart of the Persian Empire of antiquity and has long played an important role in the region as an imperial power, while Encyclopedia Iranica describes Iranian identity as a collective sense of belonging rooted in historic lands, shared history, and cultural continuity. Iranica is also very clear that after the Islamic conquest, Iran remained the main cultural area in the new Islamic world to preserve its distinct language and identity rather than being linguistically absorbed into Arabic. That matters because the Islamic Republic is 47 years old. Iranian civilization stretches back more than 2,500 years to the Achaemenid Empire. The regime and the nation are not the same thing. And one of the central tensions in this war is that the regime speaks in the name of Iran, while many Iranians experience the regime as the force that has spent decades suffocating Iran from within. Those two things are not the same. So where does that leave the endgame? Not with instant revolution, not with simple stability either, but with three broad possibilities. The system hardens under Mojtaba Khamenei and the guards, and the war drags on in a more securitized, brittle form. 2. Pragmatists manage some limited recalibration to contain the damage without changing the underlying system in any fundamental way. Some kind of reform, but still within the system. 3. The security apparatus weakens enough over time, cracks widen, and space opens for a different kind of leadership to emerge from inside the country. Not necessarily from the most visible exiled figures, and not necessarily in a neat or immediate way, but from the many people the state has spent years imprisoning, torturing, silencing, and trying to erase from public life. That third path is the one many Iranians would hope for. It is also the least immediate and the least guaranteed. None of these outcomes is neat. None of them is quick. And none of them guarantees that ordinary Iranians or Lebanese civilians or Gulf residents or anyone else pulled into this conflict see justice before they see more suffering. That is the hardest part of this story. So, what is the endgame here? The honest answer is that it is still being fought over by hardliners and pragmatists inside Iran, by Washington and Tel Aviv from outside, by Hezbollah in Lebanon, by Gulf states trying to avoid becoming the battlefield and the bill payer at the same time, and above all, by ordinary people who have already spent years living under fear and are now being told that history is moving again, only this time with missiles. For Washington and the Gulf monarchies, the worst outcome would not simply be stalemate, it would be an Iran that survives this war harder, more vengeful, and more emboldened around Hormuz than before. That would make deterrence harder, Gulf insecurity worse, and every future crisis more dangerous. Which is why the endgame may not be decided by who struck first, or even by who survives longest, but by whether the regime is weakened enough to change without the region being broken beyond recognition in the process.